Hey everyone, you are listening to the Divergent Conversations podcast. We are two neurodivergent mental health professionals in a neurotypical world. I'm Patrick Casale.
And I'm Dr. Neff.
And during these episodes, we do talk about sensitive subjects, mental health, and there are some conversations that can certainly feel a bit overwhelming. So we do just want to use that disclosure and disclaimer before jumping in. And thanks for listening. Hey everyone, welcome back to Divergent Conversations. Today we're joined by Debra Brause, Psy.D, who received her BA from the University of Pennsylvania and her doctorate in psychology from the California School of Professional Psychology. Her professional training includes diagnostic self-assessment, diagnostic assessment for learning disabilities at UCLA, a postgrad fellowship in psychoanalytic psychotherapy at the Wright Institute, Los Angeles, clinical work in community mental health settings, and continuing participation in psychoanalytic consultation groups. Speaking over my words today, has served as a clinical supervisor at multiple community mental health settings around Los Angeles and provides trainings in psychoanalytic psychology interns on neurodiversity. Prior to becoming a psychologist, Dr. Brause spent 10 years in the entertainment industry working in television production, news, and as a studio development executive. She has a blog on Psych Today about raising neurodivergent children. In her private practice, she is passionate about working with parents who are raising neurodivergent children as well as autistic adults from a neurodiversity affirming perspective. Did I miss anything in that?
No, that's great. Thank you. There's one new development, which is there's this new center in Los Angeles called the Vista Autism Project. And so they brought in this psychoanalyst named Joshua Durbin, who is training a lot of therapists in Los Angeles to work psychoanalytically with autistic children. And it will age up to young adults. But I'm in like a consultation supervision group with them and being trained to do that work. Still on the fence about whether I'm agreeing with the method, but I'm learning and just trying to sort of suss it out. So that's kind of a new.
That's really interesting. Like when you hear about kind of the typical quote unquote gold standard therapies for autistic children, you like rarely ever do you hear psychoanalysis. So that's really interesting. I'm a little bit curious. Yeah. Like how you got into that intersection of autism and psychoanalysis, because that's not a common intersection at all.
Well, he's from Israel and has trained. There's a center in Israel where I think it's a lot more common to work that way. And I believe also trained in Europe. And he sees America as sort of criminal in the way that they work with autistic children. And so I'm guessing it's very different in other countries. And so they brought him to Los Angeles, and I was just so intrigued, like I have to know what he's doing because I love psychoanalysis and I love autistic people. And as you said, like there's such little intersection. And, you know, the things that I have found when you read the old analysts talking about autism, it's like unbelievably offensive to me. And I'm just looking for some kind of neuro-affirming way to use like this wealth of knowledge and understanding of humanity and bring it to the autistic population. And so I was just so curious what he's doing. So I kind of feel like I'm a little spy in it's like a big Zoom meeting with all these therapists, and I'm just listening and trying to soak it in and like decide if I'm on board with this. But I could not do it. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's really interesting because that, like, for me, it was psychodynamic therapy that finally worked for me. But you're also absolutely right that of the like therapy in general has so much catch up to do. But I think the psychoanalytic tradition particularly has a lot of catch up to do to become affirming. So there's this kind of weird irony of dynamic therapy was the therapy that finally worked for me, but also goodness gracious, like there's a lot of pathology in that framework.
Absolutely. When people are stuck in, you know, Frances Tustin was sort of the gold standard of working with autism. And when you read that work, I mean, some of it's lovely, but there's a very particular way of seeing autism. And I just don't relate to it. And so there have not been a lot of people who have updated and kind of, I don't think anybody in that field like actually knows autistic people like as adults and just it just hasn't caught up. So I'm hoping that will change.
Yeah. Yeah. I hope so too. Because I do think, again, not for everyone, but I do think this framework for therapy works really well for some of us. I think the insight, the way of accessing our minds, I think that this can be a really rich therapy for many of us. If
Yeah.
we're working with a provider who has a affirming framework on autism.
Yeah.
Well, I know today I'm excited about what we've talked about getting into, which is things like rewriting scripts and family dynamics. Patrick and I have talked a lot about family dynamics on here, but we haven't actually done an episode yet on like family dynamics and multi-generational process for neurodiverse families. I mean, neurodivergent children typically come from neurodivergent parents. I know you actually have an exception to that in your family, but typically that's what happens.
Right.
And so then there's all these generational things that get reenacted and projected. And so I'm not really sure how to get into that conversation, but that's the conversation I'm wanting us to get into.
Yeah. I guess I would say, because there's so many layers to how we process our own internal world, and then how we do it within our families and then within the generations. So I guess I like to introduce object relations, which is kind of the school of psychoanalysis that I particularly like. And just as a general, like really brief understanding that, we are, as humans, born dependent, like more than any other species. A lot of other animals, they're born, they walk away, like we are totally dependent, helpless creatures. And we hate that. Like all of our defenses, all of our as we're growing, we are railing against this conflict that we crave connection and we crave relationship, but we're afraid of dependency and we want to be autonomous, right? And so that tension is sort of the birth of object relations, of object seeking. And object is a word for person. It just means someone that we invest emotional energy into. So anytime I say object, that's a person. It's usually a parent, but it could be anybody close to you. And we are basically seeking these objects because we have to, because we're depend on them, and yet we can't control them. And so that is sort of the core of where all of these other things come from. And we have to protect, splitting is sort of the very central to this sort of philosophy. So we need to take in the good from our mothers. I'm just saying mother, it could be any caregiver. But the good object is basically all the good stuff that we get as babies when we're being fed, when we're being cuddled, when we're being changed. That is like how we experience the good object. And then the bad object is when the parent's not available. It doesn't mean the parent is bad or they're a bad parent. It just means the stuff that we're getting from them in that moment. Like the baby doesn't understand, like, I'm hungry, no one's feeding me. And so they need to blame somebody. Someone has to pay the price for that. And so they create this bad object in their mind. And so I just want to bring that in because it kind of relates as we go along to how we relate to other people in our life. We set up these templates of our relationships that start in that really early infant stage. And when we have good enough parenting, the good and the bad come together. Like we're able to see people as whole. So that same mother who is loving and wonderful sometimes isn't there, and we're able to integrate that and be like, that's okay. She's a whole person. Sometimes she's not available. And when it's not good enough and it's too frustrating, that's where that splitting kind of can stick a little bit. And we have to protect the good from the bad and separate them, because otherwise things are too bad and it's too threatening. So I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. It does to me, but I also realize that's a lot of new ideas. What one association I'm having is to a conversation we had maybe a year ago, Patrick, with Dana Abram, author of 𝗿𝗶𝘀𝘁𝗶𝗿. And she talked about how her and her brother had very different reactions to being undiagnosed neurodivergent as children. And hers was to take on the badness, and his was the world is bad. Does that relate to this conversation of object relations?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so there are different ways we split parts of ourselves and parts of the other. So somebody's got to take the fall when things are bad, right? So,
Also, can I clarify, just because splitting's often talked about in the context of BPD, but borderline personality disorder, but you're talking about it more broadly. I think psychodynamic, psychoanalytic language in general uses a lot of language like the manic defense or splitting, but it's bigger than we're talking about the splitting in BPD. I just want to clarify that.
Yes. So splitting, we all split.
We all split. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would suggest autistic people, well, it depends. I really like Donna Henderson talks about, we've got islands of inflexibility. It's not like an autistic person is just innately inflexible. But one way that can show up is like people are good or bad. And especially because we are so value aligned, I think it's, like that person doesn't align with this value of mine, therefore like they're in the bad bucket. So I think this splitting and splitting of self, I certainly have experienced a lot of that. Or the tendency to, if there's an imperfection in our work or in ourself, like I'm all bad. Like I think that's something that autistic brains are really vulnerable to, frankly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, sometimes it's like people perceive if I have a flaw, that means I'm all bad. And so then if you feel that way, you're going to defend against having any flaws, right? Because if I have a flaw and then I'm a terrible person, I'm going to make sure I don't have any flaws, right? And then you get like more narcissistic defenses, honestly, where you're like, I'm perfect. I don't have any flaws. It must be someone else's fault. And until you can accept that, like, it's normal to have flaws, like everybody has flaws and we can accept our flaws and that doesn't make us bad people, then you don't need to defend against it.
So until we can accept our flaws, we're going to have some kind of psychological defense about it, either kind of a narcissistic defense. And again, I don't think you're talking about NPD. You're using the language of that.
Everyone has narcissistic.
Everyone has narcissistic defenses. Yeah. Or it could be, what would be the name of the defense where it's I'm all bad? Would that just be splitting or taking on the badness?
Yeah, so that's where, so we had talked about Fairbairn, who is one of the like really important early object relations theorists. And Fairbairn had this theory that that children tend to take on the all bad. He called it the moral defense. So his quote is, "It's better to be a sinner in a world ruled by God than to live in a world ruled by the devil." Right? So that means if your parents are actually bad parents, if you're in an abusive or neglectful household, you are screwed, right? And so the only way to deal with that, if you feel like your parents are not giving you what you need, is to make yourself the bad one, because then there's hope. Then you can change. Oh, it must be me. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to change my circumstances. It gives you power. You know, it's a little bit omnipotent, right? But it's like, I'm in control of the situation. If your parents are actually bad, that's a much more dangerous situation. So it's a defense to feel like you're protected.
Absolutely. I have loved that quote. I think I heard it in my training, and it was so helpful walking, especially when folks did have complex trauma and had such deep shame schemas and narratives about themselves that they just were struggling to release, realizing at one point that was actually really protective for you to say, because that element of control, like if this person is behaving toward me this way because I'm doing something, then it also means I have the power to change how people act toward me. So it's a really weird, like, it's not intuitive of why that makes sense to take on the badness, but for a child, it absolutely does. Yeah. And Patrick, I'd be curious your thoughts on this as well. But one other thing I'm thinking of, like, that makes so much sense in the context of neglect, trauma. I am also wondering about instances where, frankly, just like chronic misattunement, chronic invalidation, not because anyone is bad or good, but because we do not understand yet that the child we're parenting is neurodivergent, or we don't understand that we as the parent are neurodivergent. So I also imagine that this dynamic could play out in families where simply there's just not a lens to understand what that child needs, how to attune to that child.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many instances of that where it's like the fit between parent and child might be, I don't want to say mismatch, but where there's not enough understanding yet. And this is like the importance of early identification, because if you don't understand why my child is different, there might be so many ways that you personalize it or think, oh, my child's not responding to me, or they're not behaving in the way I expect. And so that could go like, what's wrong with my child? Or I'm a terrible parent. What's wrong with me? You know, it can lead to the parent withdrawing or getting depressed, or, you know, there's so many kind of like implications for that of how each person interprets it. Because, you know, that, and those early relationships are how we internalize the world. Like that is our sense of, is the world safe? Do people understand me? Will people, that's like all attachment theory too. Like, will people be there for me when I need them? And if you have an autistic child where maybe the affect is big and the parent doesn't understand it, then you're leading to a lot of that invalidation, right? The parent trying to maybe hand back a meaning to the child about their behavior that doesn't match what the child is experiencing. So it's, there needs to be so much support, right, around understanding, like, who is this child? Why are they behaving in this way? And for the parent to understand themselves, because so much gets projected back and forth. Like there's this idea of the container where the child is projecting their feelings into the parent, and the parent has to digest those feelings because they're overwhelming to the child, and kind of hand them back to the child in a way that feels manageable and tolerable. But if the child, let's say, is autistic, maybe the parent is not understanding this material that's coming at them. So it's like there's all this raw emotion and feeling coming at the parent. They're trying to digest it and make sense of it. But if they don't get it, or it's too big for them, and they're handing it back to the child in a way that doesn't fit, that child is then left in like a dysregulated state and feeling misunderstood. Mm-hmm. So it can be really messy, I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my only thought is like the messiness, right? Like that was my childhood. So I'm just thinking about that, like parents misattuned for sure. Not able to really model that behavior, not able to put that back to the child or repackage it in any sort of way. Right. So you are left, as you said before, with that defense of like, okay, this is too much for me to understand as a child. I know it's really messy, it's really chaotic, it's really volatile. So you do turn inwards with that for sure, of like, it must be me, or I must be the bad one here, and I must like go out onto this lifelong crusade of how do I change that, and how do I fix that, and how do I, absolve myself from that. So it's definitely messy.
Yeah. Like Patrick, not to totally put you on the spot, but I kind of feel like your life work has been about that. Like the doubt yourself, do it anyway. Like a lot of the speaking you do has been around kind of reworking the script.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's been a big part of everything that I've done, is like trying to figure out how to right that ship in a lot of ways, but also the realization of someone who doesn't have children, who's never going to have children. Like it is the reparenting piece from that attachment perspective of like, how do I reparent myself if
your own inner child?
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's been a long time coming for sure.
Yeah. Well, I've heard you two talk a lot about self-trust, right? Which is kind of what you're talking about. If I didn't have people to mirror me or like show me what my experience was, how do I trust myself to like learn about, that my behavior, my internal experience is valid and understandable, even if some people don't understand it. It makes sense still. And that's a lot of work to do on your own. And I know you've been in therapy, so like that's such an important piece of like feeling seen by someone else. Mm-hmm. And I have an autistic client. She's told me I can share this in terms of that I'm all bad sort of experience. Like she grew up, she didn't identify as autistic until recently. And, she would make friends and then on the playground, they would all pull her over and say, like, we've decided we don't want to be your friend anymore. And that would happen over and over. And, all you can do is wonder what's wrong with me, right? What is it about me? You don't know you're autistic. You don't know that maybe there's some communication difference. And then now, she has a great job, but she's like constantly plagued by this thought that she's going to get fired. She's in a relationship and always fears she's going to be left. And it's that, like, what did I do? What's wrong with me? And I think it's so important to unpack that and start changing that script, that it's never one person's fault. It's never like one side of the relationship. It's like that double empathy issue. It's like everyone's responsible here for their part. It's not just like you're the bad guy and, but it's a way of feeling like there's something you can do to control the situation.
Well, and like waiting for the other shoe to drop, like bracing for it, because it feels dangerous to let that hypervigilant guard down when you have experienced that. So it's like, I'm going to anticipate this, because the moment I lean into this and I let this be a good moment, it feels unsafe, right? So then it's that hypervigilance that we can bring to social relationships, which can actually, like, that hypervigilance we bring can make it more likely to actually happen because of the way that we're then showing up, which is such a painful part of the experience. Repetition.
Yeah, there's so much like that. The repetition compulsion, which Freud talked about. I mean, that has stuck, I think, through the centuries now of how we repeat things over and over unconsciously because, we're trying to master it. We choose people that are bad for us in a way because they represent like earlier relationships, and we're trying to do them over. We're trying to like have a better outcome this time. And we see that all the time. And like, I've heard this guy, his name's 𝗵𝗀𝘀. He's like a counselor. He talks about we create what we hate. And it's this idea, like if we're always, he has a million examples, but if we're always worried about being abandoned, let's say, because somebody abandoned us early on, then we're going to potentially get really clingy and really like, really needy in a relationship because we're always afraid we're going to be left. And then that action pushes away the person that we're depending on and just recreates the same thing. Then they do leave because they're like, oh, you're too much, right? And we just get trapped in those cycles where we just repeat, hoping for a different outcome. I'm sure like you people, one of my favorite papers is called Relentless Hope. And it's this idea that we pick people that remind us of like this frustrating earlier object. So a parent or some early caregiver. And then we like try to get them to change. Right? So like the cliche example is like someone who grew up with an alcoholic parent and then they marry an alcoholic and then they're like trying to get that person to stop drinking. Right. And it's this like relentless hope that like we're going to get this person to change and then that's going to repair that early childhood wound. And it like generally doesn't work, but we all do it to some degree until we've kind of really grieved our early wounding. But if we haven't done grief work around what we didn't get as children, then you keep seeking out. Even if you find someone good, you kind of project onto them that they're bad, and then you try to make them good again. Like it's like this. There's something about changing somebody and controlling them and making them what you need them to be. That's like an addiction almost.
Like that's the part, the reworking, the unfinished business. So, because this is interesting to me because often like in attachment theory, we'll talk about, if you grew up with insecure attachment, you can have earned security, right? And so if you attach to a secure partner, or a secure therapist, that's partly how we earn security. But part of what I'm hearing you say with this relentless hope idea is that's not enough for a lot of us because we're like, no, I've got to complete the cycle of there was an unfinished cycle. And so I actually have to find someone who's insecurely attached and make them secure. And then through that, I can get my secure attachment. Like it's not like I'm going to go find someone who offers me stability. It's I'm going to go find someone who offers me the same instability I had in childhood, and I'm going to fix them and therefore fix my childhood wound. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I don't think that's what we need to do, but I think that's the fantasy.
Or that's what we happen. That's what we unconsciously, many of us are doing. Okay.
Right. That's sort of more the unhealthy way of going about it. It's like a defense against actually grieving what we didn't get. So when we haven't grieved, then we go try to go after someone and try to control and change them and have this like omnipotent wish that they're going to be what we need them to be. But the healthier alternative is we have to recognize like we can't control other people. Like other people are separate. Other people are like anyone in the present is not responsible for what happened to us as children. And this sort of mourning about, oh, I didn't have exactly what I needed as a child, and I can mourn that and not try to seek it out in some like present bad object that I'm going to change. Right. So that's like until we do the inner work, then we're stuck in that like relentless hope cycle. It's almost like this sadomasochistic thing. Like we hope that we're going to find the person that's going to heal us. And then when they don't change, we like rage against them and like, why aren't you changing? Why aren't you who I need you to be? And then we go back to like them throwing you a little bit of crumbs and you're like, oh, but maybe they are changing. Oh, maybe they are going to give me what I need. And like go round and round. And that's the thing that we have to like actually get out of that cycle.
So this is where it gets so complex, I think, is like attraction. Like I definitely recall being like mostly attracted to unavailable humans, like like people who were very reserved, who felt mysterious. And like you can't like attraction is such a palpable thing. Like and you hear that a lot, right? You hear like, well, I'm just attracted to like, or even the stereotype of like, what is the stereotype? Like the nice guys never get, I mean, it's a very like,
and he's like the bad
stereotype.
Guy.
Yeah. Like, so that's because our unconscious is like, no, you won't help me. You won't be it. Like, I can't do my unfinished business through you. And then our like attraction system is also connected to that.
Totally. Like we're not attracted to the good guy because we don't get to rework that whole drama with the good guy. Like we want to be like, one sort of idea around the bad object is they're like tantalizing and seductive and then they reject you. And that's almost like the stereotype of like the unavailable person that we're drawn to, right? They kind of tease you and then they withdraw. And that is sort of what happened to a lot of people. Maybe not in reality, but at least in fantasy as a child, there was somehow like this tantalizing person that they wanted more of and then maybe felt rejected by. And like, that is what we're chasing. And so until you're able to like grieve that frustrating experience, you're going to keep seeking the unavailable person. And then like, you're not attracted to the good person because that's boring. That's not like, drawing, like we like that drama in a way because it's not about connection to a good person. We just want intense contact with somebody. And that might be someone who's not good for us because that reenacts the old thing.
Well, and this is probably from your world, this is probably a gross simplification, but I read years ago the book Attached about kind of adult attachment and love. And the thing that really struck me was one of the things the author said is people fall in love with the feeling of an activated attachment system. Like when my attachment system is activated, like that feeling, it is like, it gives you anxiety, it gives you excitement. And that many people confuse that with like the experience of falling in love. And I would think like an old script, unfinished business would activate our attachment system, right? Because that's that old wound in a way that we would also interpret that as attraction and all of these other things. Patrick, I am curious. I know I'm relating to a lot of this. I'm curious, are you relating to this like kind of idea?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if I take away the psychoanalytic language of all of it, then it just feels like attachment theory to me is what we're talking about in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And yeah, totally relate to this. I mean, I've definitely been the unavailable person for a lot of people in their lives, and I'm sure that's why they were attracted to me.
Right. Interesting.
I know the moment that I've pulled away, whether consciously or subconsciously. Um, and I know that that has intensified dynamics in relationships too. But I think, Deborah, what you're saying, what really resonates for me is you use like the example of like mourning that childhood experience or that wounding that you weren't able to receive this as a child or during development or early on in life, and being able to mourn that and set that to the side, or at least move through that to some degree.
Yeah.
I think that's so true. I mean, as someone who's been in lifelong
Yeah.
therapy, as I'm sure a lot of our clients who are also therapists are can relate to, and a lot of people who are listening can relate to. It's just like mourning that the childhood wounding and making peace with it to some degree of like,
Yeah.
the people in my present day are not responsible for that, and they can't
Right.
heal that, but they can be, like Megan said, secure attachments for us. And if we can work through that process of that mourning, then secure attachment is just what we need, instead of seeking out the other
Yeah.
the relationship
Exactly.
styles where they feel more exciting, more risky,
Right.
more impulse driven.
Yes. Yeah. They're more like have an addictive quality to them, right? As opposed to just like being able to sit with like somebody that's good enough. Like that was Winnicott's classic idea of the good enough mother. And same with a partner. Some people are looking for this idealized partner who's going to be like everything they needed. And that's not real. Like nobody can meet all your needs. And so like, can you find somebody that's good enough? And, you have to meet your needs in different places. But yeah, being able to accept that people have limitations. And, you hear that so much with, even right now around the holidays where people are going and they're being with their larger families, and like being able to accept that our parents have limits. They're not going to be everything we wanted, even like us as adults, and that's normal, like we all have our limits. And like, so are, is it a good enough relationship? Sometimes it's not, and you have to take care of yourself. But often it's just being able to accept reality. We kind of have this split sometimes between fantasy and reality, and like being able to live in reality that's not perfect, and coming to terms with that.
Yeah.
So yeah. And that like, I guess goes into parenting in a sense of like the family piece of you were saying how does this get repeated in families? And it's like when the parent hasn't worked through their own stuff, and then they're projecting their kind of unwanted parts, let's say, the parts of them that they haven't accepted, into their children, and then the children are holding that. That's another way that they feel shamed or feel like they're not being accepted by their parents. And so, I think a lot of people experience that now going back, and, it's just sort of an ongoing dynamic in families.
Yeah, I'll give an example of that actually. So, we spent the first 10 years of parenting our oldest without this lens. And I still like, I'm still working through forgiving myself and like the grief of the ways I misattuned to her when she was little. But like when she was younger, she was very ADHD dominant. And so we'd go to a store and, she'd want to be running around. And throughout my whole life, and for my spouse as well, for different reasons, but for both of us, we have both worked so hard to not take up space. And I've, worked so hard, like when I'll be in a meeting and I always wanted to move my body and I suppress it. So this idea of suppressing movement and things that make me louder was a huge part of my psychology that I didn't yet understand. So then when my daughter is being hyperverbal and loud and running, I get embarrassed, I get shame, and I move to suppress that behavior. And that I feel like is a kind of, that would be an example of projection of this is activating my embarrassment and my shame. And I haven't worked through what it means to be in a body that wants to move and wants to be loud. And how dare my daughter do that? And that sort of projection, I think, happens all the time in neurodiverse families, where these things kind of get projected from generation to generation of the things that we haven't accepted about ourselves. we then try to train out of our children.
Exactly. Yeah, that's such a classic example. And like, particularly with those ADHD traits where things are maybe louder or bigger, if you have a parent who was raised to be proper, like behave a certain way in public, and then you have a child who's acting in a way that you're like embarrassed of, for lack of a better word. And then, yeah, you're trying to squash it and shame them out of it. And if that doesn't get looked at, I mean, once you realize, oh, this is what neurodivergence is, and this is something that I have to this is the way my child is, I don't have to change them. But, until that time comes, like the amount of, I mean, that's happening all the time, right? Anytime you go out in public, you're probably seeing that. But it's such a way that that shame gets handed down. And, that whole intergenerational transmission is also so fascinating because like we're seeing now, through projection, through what I call projective identification, we project that shame into the child and they carry it. And then if they don't examine it, they project it into their child. But there's also this epigenetic layer, which is a whole nother thing, which is like how our experience actually shapes our genes. And so when we experience trauma, that encodes like how our genes are expressed in later generations. So it's like magic, but it's this crazy way that like what we're experiencing now actually does get handed down. And it's so kind of mysterious, but it just speaks to the importance of like self-examination and trying to like work through our own shame and the ways that we don't love ourselves.
Let's shift to talk about that a little bit of like how like the process of creating new scripts this happens a lot, especially in neurodiverse families where a lot of old projections and scripts and enactments get passed down. How do we rewrite old scripts? Like, what's the process around that?
Yeah. I mean, I always think about like really noticing what triggers you. So if you're with your child and they're doing something and you notice you're getting activated or you're getting embarrassed, like that's your like red flag, right? Like pause button. What is going on here? Is my child really doing something that they shouldn't be doing? Or is like, what's going on inside of me? Am I embarrassed? Does this go back to my childhood? I wasn't allowed to act this way, like and also it so depends, like, do I know my child's neurodivergent or that I'm neurodivergent? Like that's where so much discovery has to happen. But regardless, like whatever's going on, like to know before I am kind of trying to control my child, can I look at myself and think about like what's going on here that I'm reacting to? Because it might just be, oh, I'm embarrassed because I wasn't allowed to behave this way in public, or I don't think it's the right way to be. And maybe we have to challenge that before we're trying to like shame a child out of their behavior. And so I think there is a lot of, there's so many new parenting kind of perspectives around like really understanding what's underneath behavior, like getting away from that like reward punishment kind of systems, like we're trying to control and manage children's behavior, and more into like how can we think about the behavior, or how can we try to understand why is my child behaving this way? And like Mona Delahooke, I don't know if you've ever read her work. She's this like amazing child therapist who writes about the brain-body connection and just really trying to understand why is my child behaving this way and what's going on in their nervous system, like really understanding, is this something is bottom up or top down? Like, were they able to control this behavior, or is this just something that happened automatically? And you can't punish somebody for doing something that their nervous system told them to do, right? It wasn't intentional. It wasn't a conscious thought. Even if it's aggressive or violent, like sometimes that is just coming from a nervous system place that they really didn't have control over. So you really have to think about, how am I going to approach that child and really think about their behavior before I jump in to like punish them or change them. It takes a lot of like what we call reflective functioning, which is like thinking about the state of mind of the other. And, in terms of attachment, it's like the research is so interesting that even if we don't understand what's going on in our child, just the act of thinking about what might be going on in their mind creates a secure attachment. So you might get it wrong, but the fact that you are reflecting on what is going on inside my child's mind is like the key to security. Like being able to hold someone else's mind. And you're not always going to be right, but it's just that act of connection.
And I would guess that'd be similar for like partnerships. Like if you're in an argument with your spouse or a tough moment with your partner, like the ability to pause and reflect on what might be happening in the other person's mind.
Yeah.
That would also help support that. Yeah, I talk about meta communication a lot. And I'm like perhaps live too much in meta communication, but I think that ability to like zoom out what's happening here, what might be happening for the other person, what scripts are playing for the other person, what old historical script has just been activated through this conflict.
Yeah. It kind of zooms you out where it's like, it's not like someone's the bad guy. Like you're the bad guy or I'm the bad guy. It's like, there's that third of like, what's happening, like however we're both acting makes sense in each of our minds. And how can we zoom out and look at like the bigger picture of like, we're both interacting from like all these internal people that are in our brains and our old scripts and our old ways of being. And like, that's clashing right now. And how can we, like with couples therapy, look at how is the pattern the problem, not the person.
Right.
Like, how can we look at what's happening between us? And that's the thing that we're both as a team kind of looking at as like, how can we stop that pattern?
And that's personally where I've felt most stuck with clients in the past is when I can't help them make that transition from who's at fault to the dynamic is the problem, that there's something that we're either enacting or something that is happening here that is bigger than either of us. And that's the problem, not me, not you. And I think once we can make that step, that's where all of a sudden, especially like in couples work, that's where we can shift into something much, much more productive than who's at fault and who's to blame, which is what I think, even on a larger scale, like Patrick and I had a recent conversation about kind of politically everything that's happening. And even on a large like society scale, we get pulled into that dynamic of
who's the bad guy?
Yeah. Who's the bad guy? Who's the scapegoat?
Yeah, totally. It's very easy to project out the badness must be in that other. And, you know, we get rid of the parts of ourselves that we're uncomfortable with, and then someone's got to hold that. And so now it's, you know, it's the immigrants. They're the problem. You know, we like project out whatever we don't like, and then somebody's got to hold that for us. And then we can point the finger. It's like such a human process, but like you can see with splitting, like just how split the world is right now into these like us and them dynamics. And it's like a very early kind of mental state that we all have. And we have to like work on owning the parts of us that we are not so happy with, that are aggressive or that are negative, and so that we don't have to project them out. It's like being able to accept all our parts.
So acceptance, grief, I think I also hear like making space for complexity, the complexity of like, I am many things, and parts, like there are parts of me that are bad, parts of me that are good, parts of the person I love that are good, bad. Like, so I'm hearing that a lot of expansion comes from when we're able to embrace complexity, accept, and grieve, which frankly, I don't think and I know this podcast is more global. I'm talking about the US, specifically white culture. We are terrible at grief. We have like, we hide death, we hide aging, we like have billion-dollar industries to like protect us from aging, which is really like we are terrible at grief. And we have so much denial, which I think that's why the pandemic hit us psychologically so hard, is because it shot through a lot of the defenses we have as a culture around death, around grief, around our fragility.
Yeah. We hate vulnerability. Right. And so, yeah, it has to be someone else's fault. That's like where the manic defenses come in. We try to do whatever we can to deny reality and make it seem like that's not real. That's not happening. We're grandiose and we're above it. We're not going to age or die. It's, such a fear.
I think one of the best things for me as a human in my like development was immersively living in Malawi for 6 months. And I was probably at a funeral every weekend during that time. And just experiencing and being immersed in a culture that had come to terms with the fact that death is part of life forever changed me. And the way joy was experienced, the way like simple pleasures were experienced, it just was such like in my body viscerally, it was such a different experience than what we do here in the States around denial of these things that frankly, I think we have a lot of repressed grief around.
Definitely.
Yeah. It almost feels like actual living, what you're talking about, Megan, like actually living and experiencing all of those emotions and really not taking those things for granted, for sure.
Yeah.
I've literally called it full spectrum living before and I think it's Brene Brown who has the quote, like, you can't selectively numb emotions. So if you're numbing the harder emotions like grief and vulnerability and shame, you're also going to be numbing like the more positive emotions. Not that we need to dichotomize emotions as positive and negative, but that idea of you can't selectively numb emotions. And that's exactly how I felt, Patrick, because I was like, well, this feels like full spectrum living, full spectrum feeling. And I haven't been able to access that in the States. As much as I like try to be expansive in my own emotional experience, when you're just plugged into a culture that's more restricted, I think it's a lot harder.
Totally. We don't have like language for just or knowing how to tolerate sitting in those sad emotions and feeling like we can bear it, and that we can do it together. It's like we need to push it away as quickly as possible and move on. And just, part of psychoanalysis is really like giving people, we're not solving their problems. We're helping them just learn how to tolerate life, like how to feel like they have coping skills and they have ways of seeking relationships and being with their feelings. They might feel worse. They might experience their feelings more, but they're more alive rather than coming up with defenses to like bury the feelings or push them away or deny them. So it's complicated.
I love that as a description of the goal of a lot of psychoanalytic work. That was when I started my psychodynamic therapy partly because I was in training and partly there were just things I wanted to work through. And I remember talking with my therapist early on of like, kind of what's the goal here? Because I didn't have like acute depression or anxiety at the time. And I really loved how he explained it's about expanding. And that was my experience I did 4 years of that at the end of it, I felt like such a more expansive, alive version of myself than the person walking in who felt very constricted, restricted, over-controlled. It was just, I think that's such a beautiful expression of what depth therapy is about. It's about becoming more of yourself and expanding into it.
Totally. I love that you have that experience. It's like accessing more parts of yourself, right? And accessing like things that maybe you had dissociated or weren't even in touch with. And now like being more free, we're not as constrained by the past and the old relationships, and we can experience ourselves in the present and experience parts of ourselves that maybe we had, suppressed, repressed, and now we're more integrated. So it's like being,
I think our relationships expand too, because then we're able to like make space for other people's complexity and to understand these like dynamics that we fall into with people in our lives.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like seeing people as whole objects, as we call them. So you're not just seeing them as good or bad, but like people are complicated and they're contradictory and,
So it's a whole object when you can hold like the complexity of a person, that they are both good and bad.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And see all their parts.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we often split the world into like the good guys and the bad guys, and everything in our culture kind of colludes with that. But it's like, how do we see the complexity of people? That nobody's all good or all bad. We have all different parts that get acted out we change in different relationships. So different parts of us come out in relationship to different people, and it's like just having access to all of it at different times. But
So this is also explaining to me why I burned out on social media, because I bet on social media there's a lot of projection of good objects, bad objects, and probably not a whole lot of space for whole objects.
yeah.
Almost none.
There's a lot of attacking, right? A lot of like, you said one thing, I'm going to attack it, and now you're all bad, and there's no way I'm going to see the whole of you.
Attacking, comparison, or just 100% echo chamber agreeance and adherence, which is not healthy either, in my opinion. So,
Yeah. Hard to like remember that this is one sliver of someone's experience that you're reading, and to not like jump down someone's throat assuming that is like all of them or that's the whole story. It's such a tough medium, because there is this like group think, right, where everyone just jumps on the bandwagon and people get bullied, and it's can be really a really challenging place to sit.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, good place for splitting.
Well, and it's interesting. I mean, these dynamics have always been part of human societies, but I think with so much of our communication shifting to digital, and for the record, like there are so many pros of that. Like we're literally here talking because of these technological advancements, but communication's gotten faster. And I think it just makes sense that in a less embodied format for communication, that more of these perhaps like earlier defenses, younger defenses would take root more quickly because of kind of the fragmented nature of digital communication.
Right. I was thinking about that the other day, where I have a client a lot of people wear Apple Watches, and he's like getting dinged through the whole session. Like he's a really intense job, and like every 2 seconds the thing's going off. And there's this idea of the holding environment that Winnicott came up with, where it's like the mother is supposed to like create this environment where nothing is impinging on the experience of the infant. It's like they're in this very safe, contained space that is, it's like the mother enters the world of the infant and is preoccupied with them. And that's almost what you're trying to hold in therapy. And then you have this digital intrusion that is like, every second the outside world is coming into the session and like reminding him of work and all the stress of his life. And it's like, how am I not like, that is not okay. Like I need to be able to be like, you need to put that in the waiting room or something. Like this is our space to protect you from all that outside world stuff, and enter almost like a dream. Like the session is supposed to feel like a dream, almost like you're able to play with ideas. You're able to enter into this sort of metaphorical space where we can just think about whatever's coming up. Mm-hmm. And when the outside world keeps coming in, it just kind of impinges on that and breaks that spell.
Yeah. You're not able to enter into that kind of deep state. Yeah. I had an association when you were talking. I'm totally mixing ideas here, but I'm gonna just share it. When you're talking about the idea of the container, which is an idea I love, I realized I think I create that for myself through monotropic focus. I think when I get overwhelmed with life, I create a container where nothing can get in except the thing that I am choosing to focus on. And I think that is one of the things I do the most for self-soothing. And I think it's like there's a process, there's something there where I'm creating a self-container for myself. And I do it quite often, which my spouse, I feel bad for my spouse because he often talks about how hard it is to get a hold of me because I just turn all notifications off. But yeah, those having pockets of containers where we can go more deep and we're not getting pinged and ponged this way and that way is so important, whether it's with another person or with ourselves.
Yeah, the goal is to be able to do it internally, right? To like take in that containing function that the therapist or mother provided and to internalize it so that when you're feeling overwhelmed, you come up with a containing function inside yourself. So you're doing that for yourself in a way that you like were able to take in the function itself and do it for yourself, which is ultimately the goal.
Yeah.
So that's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we've diverged a bit. Is there anything that any itchy thoughts, as I like to say, anything we haven't touched on that you're like, if we end now, you'll be like, oh my goodness, there's this thing.
I have always wanted to tell the story of the Apollo 13 story that I mentioned to you. Can I just throw that in briefly?
Yeah, I think it's a really powerful story about like the work of rewriting old scripts. Yeah.
Okay.
Please.
So might feel unrelated, but it's sort of like this, how intrapsychically we work through trauma. And how there's this idea of the unthought known that Christopher Bolles came up with. And it's the idea that there are things that we know that we haven't even thought about yet, but we know them somehow in our bodies. And so, and I'm not saying this to have a depressing story, but just because I find it fascinating. When my son was born, my water broke early and I went into labor and he could not get out. Right? He was stuck and they had to basically push him out through an emergency C-section, and he came out and was blue. And there was 20 minutes of resuscitation before they could get a heartbeat. And so when he was about 4 or 5, he was in preschool, he would act out the story of Apollo 13. And we had all these, like every figurine you could imagine, from the rocket and the launch center. He had an astronaut suit. Our dog had an astronaut suit. And the story of Apollo 13 is that Jim Lovell and 2 other astronauts were supposed to land on the moon, and their oxygen tank exploded. And so they couldn't land. And so they had to figure out a way with the remaining oxygen. They had to like go into the lunar module, which was only meant to last for 2 days, and it lasted for 4. But they had to go around and orbit the moon in order to come back and finally land on Earth. And they were never able to go to the moon. And for me, and he was out of school at the time that was like very psychodynamic and like very into the unconscious. And we were just talking about how like in his body, it's like this story represented his birth story, where like he lost oxygen, he couldn't land. And that somehow he found a way, like he didn't have a mind yet to mentalize or think about what had happened. He didn't understand it, of course, but in his body, he was like found this metaphor to represent his story that was like a way of kind of working through the trauma. And they created a book for him that was like a narrative about his birth. That was sort of a little autobiography to kind of create a way to process the trauma so that we had a story for it and that it could be worked through. And I just like find the brain so amazing that we can find and like latch onto things that represent our internal world, even though we have no idea what we're doing at the time. And so that to me was just like the power of the unconscious to heal, like that we're all trying to heal whatever traumas we have, and we find ways to do it consciously or unconsciously. So wanted to share that because he's an amazing guy. And
that is both a sad but also a really beautiful story, and just how creative and generative his mind was to be able to find a way to work through that. And it reminds me, something I say a lot, it reminds me of play is so important. Play is so productive. Like totally. That, I mean, I don't know if he was experiencing that as play. It probably would have looked like play, but he was doing very serious business in that repetitive play that he was engaged in.
We went down to like the Space Center in Houston and like saw like the, command central. And the cool thing was he wrote a letter to Jim Lovell, the head astronaut, and he got a letter back from him sort of saying like, we're going to prep you for the next mission. And like, we really like played this whole thing out. And at the same exact time, they flew a space shuttle into Los Angeles and parked it here. And like, it was all just sort of happening at the same time. So it's really cool. To really rework that.
Yeah. That's a beautiful story to end on, how generative these things can be worked through
Yeah.
and felt through. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Mm.
So that's my invitation for everyone to do psychodynamic work or psychoanalytic work.
That's a good call to action for sure.
Yeah.
It's a really great story to recap this conversation and to end on. So thanks for sharing that. That's super powerful.
Of course.
As always, we always ask our guests at the end if you have anything you want to share with the audience, where they can find you, if you have anything that you're offering right now, and we'll include that in the show notes as well.
Yeah, just my website. It's Dr. Debra Brause. It's 𝗲𝗶𝘀𝘀𝘁𝗶𝗿.com. I have a blog on Psychology Today, and so most of those blogs are on the website. And that's about it. I'm in Los Angeles, so can work with people in California. But that is the way to find me. I'm on Instagram at Debra Brause. I rarely post, but have a little bit on there.
Cool. Well, we'll have all of that in the show notes for everyone to have access to Debra's information and contact. If you are in Los Angeles or California and you are interested in that type of therapy approach, I think that's really fascinating. Megan, any last second thoughts before we close out?
No, just or no, and then I proceed to talk. Thank you so much for coming on. This has been a really rich conversation, and yeah, I just appreciate your depth of knowledge and what you are doing, because I know what you're doing is pretty rare in regards to the intersection of autism and psychoanalytic work. So just thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Of course, you guys are like amazing, and I've listened to every single podcast and I follow everything you do, and I just am blown away by your work, and I'm so grateful to be here. So thank you.
To everyone listening to Divergent Conversations, new episodes are out on Fridays on all major platforms and YouTube. You can download, subscribe, and share. And goodbye.